Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Not Just Tiny Humans, Conducting Pediatric Clinical Trials, presented by Roe. I'm Joe Keenan, contributing editor to Fierce Markets, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Jamie Arnott, BSN, RN, and Project Director at Roe, and Caitlin Hirschman, BSN, RN, Clinical Team Lead at Roe. You can read their full bios on the right side of your window. Just a few technical notes before we begin. If you'd like to download the slide deck, please click the Resources List button at the bottom of your screen. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. We will follow the presentation with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button on the left side of your screen, and you can do that throughout the presentation. Okay, we're ready to begin. Jamie, please go ahead.
Thanks, Joe. This is Jamie Arnott. I've been at Roe now almost 6 years, but I've been in the industry over 18 years. I started my career as a bedside nurse, working with oncology subjects, both adult and pediatric. When I moved over into the research field, I have done phase 1 through phase 3 studies in oncology, rare diseases, ENT, and really adult and pediatric. Most recently, I've been focused on cystic fibrosis studies here at Roe.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Hirschman. I've been at Roe for the past 3 years. I, like Jamie, have been in clinical research for about 18 years. I started as a medical intensive care nurse with my focus in respiratory, gastrointestinal, and infectious disease, and moving into clinical research with the same therapeutic areas in GI, respiratory, infectious disease, and have been focused working with cystic fibrosis on and off for the past 8 years. Here's our agenda for today. We're going to start with subject recruitment. How do we find these pediatric subjects? Moving to subject retention. Once we have them, how do we keep them? Informed consent, very important part of this process, and any other additional considerations. So starting with subject recruitment, here we're really going to start thinking about all the different perspectives of recruitment, whether it's from the CRO here at Roe, at the sponsor or the client, at the site, with the family themselves, as well as the subject. So let's start here. What's in it for me or my child? Again, this is the first distinction in a pediatric clinical trial, is you're not just focused on the child, you're focused on the family as well. And so you really have to make sure that you recognize who you're talking to and that who is involved in the trial itself. One of the first things to consider is whether or not there's a therapeutic benefit, really evaluating what the options are for the subject's indication. Again, this will come up as part of your informed consent process, but when there are approved effective treatments available, parents are likely to be reluctant to sign their child up when they may receive placebo, or whether or not it's approved a product and whether or not it will benefit their child. Really helping them understand that providing access to care, getting more frequent visits, some of the subject visits may be much more often and would be something that may be a benefit to these subjects and their families. Really, some of these medical procedures can be very costly and can be something that can be of great advantage for them. Sometimes the frequency of subject visits may actually lend themselves to identifying a medical issue that otherwise might not be observed until much later in the disease process. So again, those frequent visits are valuable. Any possibility of receiving a newer or better treatment when there is no approved treatment is something to consider as well. And just again, as we go through these slides, we'll talk about the risk of placebo or any unknown adverse effects. Again, moving on, what's in it for me, my child? As Jamie, I'm going to further talk about access to frequent medical care. we're talking about rare disease, we're talking about children, looking at everyone's point of view. Sometimes a child may come up with an ailment and maybe not want to go to the pediatrician or go to a specialty office. However, with these visits, with these subjects, with these study visits, they're having more frequent access to this medical care, and they can ask about something, a one-off that they wouldn't bring them into the office. Access to study medication, again, as Jamie had pointed out, some of these medications are very expensive. So this gives them the opportunity to get these medications for free, participating in these clinical trials. Moving on to additional financial incentives. Of course, IRB approval is required for any types of financial or other incentives, but they really may incentivize these children, these families to participate. Again, a lot of these folks with the rare diseases, they have medical costs that are extraordinary. So these additional financial incentives may help the whole family. And then in talking about these creative incentives geared to specific ages, starting with the very young folks, just having little trinkets, little puzzles, little balls, little games that they would like. Moving on to electronic devices, we've really moved into the electronic age. So putting trainings on these tablets, and in our experience, we've had a study where e-diary information or trainings was loaded onto these tablets, and they use these throughout the study, and then at the end of the study, the tablets were wiped clean, and these subjects were able to keep the tablets. I mean, that's a huge incentive. And then entertainment provided during these visits. Again, these are kids, some with very short attention spans, so having entertainment available during these visits is very important.
Yeah, and I'll just add in there, Caitlin, that oftentimes this is a conversation as a CRO you'll want to have with the conversation early on in the planning phases of the study, really determining what makes sense for these incentives. What do the different sites think is valuable? What do they think may be needed for them? And then working with your IRB to see what makes the most sense. So continuing on, what's in it for me or my child in terms of research benefit? This is really an individual research benefit, but also as a disease group. A lot of subjects with rare diseases and orphan indications recognize that it may be that they've exhausted all other treatment options and need to have something that will help benefit potentially not necessarily their child, but future benefit for others with the disease. A lot of families may have a history of a disease or a genetic disorder that they recognize that their child may not directly benefit, but potentially offspring of future generations, potentially carriers, could really benefit from this research. So really helping understand what this can mean towards advancing science. I will say, again, as we said, we worked in cystic fibrosis, and we know that in this population, over 70% of those patients will participate in a clinical trial. And that's really important to know that this is something that people are interested in, and they need the information, and we need to share that and make sure that they recognize, even if their child can't benefit, that they may still be looking for opportunities to participate.
And then moving on to patient advocacy groups. These have been a very powerful tool working with them. Many of the rare disease and orphan indications have these active advocacy groups. It's a way to get involved. And it's not just, they don't just look at treating the disease. They look at supporting the patients and their family and all the life challenges that come with these rare diseases. So we found a lot of benefit working with these patient advocacy groups. When a sponsor is involved, they can provide protocol input right at the beginning of the study. So we're starting right at the beginning. They also, some of them can provide help with feasibility. We know that, some sponsors conduct their own, some CROs conduct their own feasibility. But some of these patient advocacy groups, they really have a main line into the population with this particular disease.
These groups are motivated to help these subjects, help these families. They provide trainings. They want to help us understand the therapeutic indication. They provide trainings for families. They provide trainings for CROs. So again, in our experience, we found a lot of benefit from working with this patient advocacy groups, but also we know from, we certainly heard that they provide a lot of support for these families.
So let's talk about some specific recruitment tactics. Obviously, there's direct outreach to parents. These are things that we work with our sites to get IRB-approved documents, whether there's email language, potentially a phone call script, or flyers that they can put up in their doctor's office. These are things that can immediately grab those potential patients that they have on their registry that they've identified as a potential client. But then there are some types of patients that aren't necessarily seen on a regular basis. And perhaps it's an otherwise healthy child but has an ear infection. This is one of the items where we might go to a primary and secondary pediatric providers for consideration, whereas you may take your child in for an ear infection to their primary care doctor and they get referred to an ENT specialist. So really understanding where will these patients be seen initially? Where is that location? Where should that advertising be focused? What kind of training can we offer those primary care doctors so that they know about the study, they know who the principal investigator is, and they can quickly get patients funneled over to where they need to be? And this comes into our refer a friend here. Really helping to get those subjects to be seen by the appropriate team members. Again, these types of advertising, social outreach, that type of thing, all must be IRB approved, but again, that's part of that initial setup and conversations that go on.
And then talking about social media here in the bottom of the screen, it's become a very powerful tool to finding things, and I think that most folks that are here listening would tend to agree that a lot of the children today are finding lots of information on social media. So, why not use that to the benefit of promoting a study, with IRB approval and certainly within parameters. But again, very powerful tool in terms of recruitment. Some of these folks with the rare diseases, they're homeschooled. They're home. They have their tablets. They have their devices, and in their free time when they're not being homeschooled, they're flipping through the contents and possibly looking for studies, just depending on the age of the child.
Yeah, and I'll just state that really understanding what motivates folks to join studies or that really makes their disease a challenge, and really trying to help remove any of those barriers to recruitment to help identify those.
All right, so now we have the subjects recruited, and how do we keep them? How do we keep them interested in the study? Okay, how do we make this work? We're going to start from the beginning. We're going to start from the protocol development level. This is speaking mostly to the sponsor, also CROs, as they oftentimes are assisting the sponsor in developing the protocols. Okay, when we talk about visit windows, allowing flexibility, allowing enough time. Again, you're not just looking at one adult individual that's just worried about their schedule. You're worrying about a subject in a family, so you really have to think about that family unit. So allowing maybe plus 2 or 3 days on either side of that window, really important. And then ensure every visit is required. Again, these folks are young, they have short attention spans, and let's not put in extra visits just because. Let's minimize those visits. And then also thinking of lab draws. The amount of blood volume, when you consider a 3-year-old versus a 17-year-old, that's huge. 3 mils for a 3-year-old is a big difference for 3 mils, 3 cc's for a 17-year-old. So just keeping that in mind. I'm going to give an example of, in my past in terms of a protocol that maybe wasn't as well considered or just maybe could have been a little bit more fine-tuned. It was a study we did on a pediatric population. So there was an age limit and there was also a weight limit. But then to throw a third there was also an academic assessment. So if you thought about it, a kid that weighs X amount and is, 7 years old may not have the capacity to complete X academic assessment. So again, you really need to think about all these factors when creating the protocol. So this starts right at the beginning.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in, Caitlin. Part of that challenge is understanding what is the population you're looking towards to enroll in the study. If that's really the narrow population that you need, recognize that and adjust your timelines accordingly. That recognize it may take more time to enroll the study.
Yeah. Moving on to schedule coordination, thinking about the site, scheduling with the site, and again with the subject and the family. Really thinking that evening and weekend visits. These folks, a lot of working parents. Kids are at school, those that aren't homeschooled. Those kids are at school, they have afternoon activities. So, opening up to evening and weekend visits for these subjects is really beneficial. And then talking about who needs to attend the visits with the subject, understanding that at the first visit or while you're going through the informed consent process, certainly it's going to be, the subject, the parents, maybe the parents first and then the subject all together. But then once these visits get started, can the grandma accompany the child to the visits? Can a babysitter accompany the child to the visits? If these are teenagers that are driving, can they come themselves? I mean, even if they're dropped off. So really things to talk about right at the beginning. And then the visit environment, also very important. Again, likely it's going to be a family that's coming if there are multiple siblings. We want to make this a kid-friendly office space, okay, someplace that the child wants to go to. And then, like I mentioned, often there are siblings who may accompany. So having the office set up to accommodate, not just the child, but possibly the child and, 2, 3, 4 siblings.
So how do I make this work? Continuing on, sometimes in terms of retention, you've got to think about troubleshooting. You've got to realize one of the big risks is when there's a perceived lack of therapeutic benefit for the patient. And the family's, what's in it for us? Why are we continuing to do these visits? And really helping to troubleshoot this always starts with frequent communication. And that's communication with the site, with the subject, the site with the family, making sure that all their questions are answered, encouraging those parents to address any concerns, to bring up any issues they've had. Again, revisiting the informed consent process can be really valuable because there are things in the protocol that, as a site, you may already know is there, but the family may forget. For example, rescue medication. If this protocol allows for rescue medication, let's say it's a pain study and the child is having extra pain and they need some sort of coverage, that the study may allow for that, whereas the family may think that the subject needs to just drop out of the study. And so really helping them be well informed about the study and continuing to provide that access to frequent medical care, recognizing the frequency of visits, when will the next visit occur, scheduling those out, making sure that they're all scheduled early in the study so that you can know when the visits will occur and they'll know when to expect. But these communications are really critical, particularly to help resolve any concerns that they may have, really when there's a perceived lack of benefit.
Again, still talking about recruitment tactics, retention tactics, keeping the subjects interested in participating, keeping those families interested. It really starts with the investigator. It really starts with the site staff. Talking about the importance of remaining in the study. Starting with adding in the scientific benefit, at least for the subject to make it to a primary outcome. The primary endpoint, really if a subject family is not interested in staying with it, talking about let's make it to X point. Let's make it to that primary endpoint. And then you can move on and talk about the extension and extended release options. So really needs to come from the investigator. And then with each visit, the site staff really encouraging these subjects to continue to participate. Revisiting the consent. We often talk to site staff about revisiting the consent, if not with every visit, maybe with every other visit. This is what you signed up for. This is what the study involves, and just reminding them. Again, we talked about IRB allowed incentives. Certainly for these younger kids and even moving into these older kids, you actually, if possible, want to make it so they want to come to the office, want to come to these study visits. So, whatever you can do, coloring books, video games, any treats, any stickers. I mean, let's face it, some of these younger subjects, they're just excited to get their sticker and their ball. So really talking about that from the very beginning and having those things available. We talked about this before, keeping the visits short attention spans, keeping those visits short. And then again, limiting procedures and assessments to only what is necessary. We don't want to keep these kids around if it's not necessary.
We've talked about informed consent a little bit throughout, and really we want to dive a little bit deeper here as the process continues throughout the life of the study. How do I sign up? Well, the consent process is similar to adults in that you're going to review the document, you're going to review the process, what the study entails, what the expectations are. But there can be more than one discussion that occurs. There may be multiple individual conversations to adequately address all the concerns. So there may be a meeting with the parent alone. Depending on the age of the child, they may not understand, and the parent may need more lengthy explanation. There may need, if the child is a teenager, they may want to have a conversation separately as well with the investigator. Additionally, there would be a discussion together to make sure that the whole family understands what the consent process is, what information is included for the trial, and what the study expectations are. Oftentimes, parents want to know information at the end of the trial, including items such as treatment arm, any ongoing or future access to treatment. So it's important to have this information, to have the answers to these questions at the beginning so the sites can provide this during this consent process. One of the challenges of the consent that you will want to think about as you're planning your enrollment is that there can be working parents. So getting two parents in the room can be a challenge. And while some studies don't require a two-parent consent, it really is dependent on the IRB as well as your site or institutional requirements. So understanding this and getting that understanding early on will help plan for this. Additionally, if there's a custodial issue, if there's a divorce and there are two separate parents and you need to get both parents buy-in, then that's really important to do early on and really make sure that everyone is involved in the conversations. As a reminder, we may need to get reconsented if there are amendments throughout the study. So this, again, goes back to the review at each visit, reviewing that they don't have any additional questions about the consent, as well as re-signing any future ones to review any new information about the study.
And thanks, Jamie. I also wanted to add, going back to, having both parents, again, you need to find out what your IRB requires. But in terms of, working parents can be difficult, but with that added challenge of the custodial issues, you may have, if the parents aren't together, you may have one parent that really wants the child to participate and one parent that doesn't. So knowing what your IRB required, what rights there are, and how to handle that.
Additionally, most sites typically require an assent as well. And there can be different levels of assent based on the age of the children, mainly for reading level appropriateness. So we've seen them where they may be ages 7 to 12 and then perhaps 12 to 17 for adolescents. Again, this really will gear towards their reading level as well as enough information that they can understand the study without having too much of a deep dive into the details of the study. So again, working with your site as well as the IRB to determine what is required and making sure that the different level of assents, depending on the enrollment for your study, are addressed.
All right, and now we move into additional considerations, just things that you may need to think about when you're, beginning to conduct a pediatric clinical trial. This first item, and I know we've already gotten a question about it, is regarding pregnancy tests. You think, really? That my child is 9 years old, they're taking a pregnancy test? Depending on the IRB and the institution requirements, they may start them as young as 8, 9 years old taking a pregnancy test. So really being prepared to discuss this. Again, it certainly is listed in the informed consent, so making sure you go through this informed consent with the parent and the child, being as straightforward as possible that a pregnancy test is required for your child, even if you don't think that that's appropriate. And then really, if the test comes out positive, talking with your IRB, talking with your institution, and knowing how to deliver this information. Because while the likelihood of a 9 or 10-year-old being pregnant, if you have a young adolescent, a teenager being pregnant, the possibility is there. And knowing how to deliver this information and how best it's going to be received. Also, the next bullet there, in terms of siblings, can siblings participate? We've had studies where they can. Sometimes that's an exclusion criteria. It certainly might increase enrollment if it's a genetic disorder and it runs in the family. However, there's a possibility it may introduce bias. You have a brother and a sister that are participating, and the son is taking the medication and feels great. However, daughter who's also participating, they're not feeling as good. So the son may say, maybe I'm not feeling as good as I thought I was feeling. So possibly some bias there. And then risks with home treatment, making sure that the medication is labeled properly. Me personally, I participated in a study. There was a family. The study was being conducted in the U.S., and there was a family with 2 different family members, 2 different children that were participating in the clinical trial. And they were coming from Israel every month for their study visits and bringing their study medication with them. And it was noticed after drug accountability was conducted that the children had mixed up their study medication. And the site was retrained. The site retrained the family about making it really clear that they needed to separate the study medication. So, using markers, Sharpie markers, and making sure that the boxes are well marked with each of the children's separate medication, but avoiding this because that has all sorts of downstream effects when they mix up their study medication.
So we don't, in clinical research, we don't want to disrupt kids' lives. As much as possible, we want to keep them on schedule. We want to keep them going to school or homeschooling. However, we recognize that some of the clinical trials require dosing during school hours. This can be an additional issue and challenge that may require more paperwork with the school staff. So determining how do we make this work for us will require additional conversations. If the IP is going to be administered by the school staff that needs extra training, if there's anything they need to watch for or keep an eye on for the subject, perhaps watch them for 15, 20 minutes, those types of things are things that need to be documented. And how will the whole process be documented by the school staff in order to meet all the requirements of your clinical study? So while it isn't impossible, these are things that you'll want to consider, and you'll want to make sure that the family has all the necessary tools to make this a successful option for them. Additionally, we recognize that sometimes these subjects may have to miss school due to the visits. And so minimizing that as much as possible. I know Caitlin mentioned earlier about evening or weekend visits, making those an option, really making the visit time an opportunity to see the subject very quickly and give them your most ideal visit time. Again, early in the morning is also another option, and really having them with very limited wait times in your office. There isn't a few years ago, I worked as a camp nurse where we had a child who was on a peanut allergy study. So again, while I wasn't running the study, I was able to see how there was a lot of training that needs to occur for the nursing staff and the staff at the camp to allow this child to participate. The family was very eager for her to be a part of this overnight camp experience. And so what does that mean for their schedule, and really the camp itself accommodating this child's needs and really ensuring that that training and information is there in order to make it successful. Continuing on, really with these other considerations, when you're writing a protocol in a pediatric population, you really want to limit your subjective reporting opportunities. This is a population that may look to the parent. They really want parent approval, or they may look to the parent because they're not quite sure how to answer the question. And really, again, this is really age dependent. But if they're having pain and they say, where does it hurt? A lot of times kids will actually look to the parent to sort of see, how should I answer this question? And so really focusing on the objective outcomes for a study, particularly for primary and secondary endpoints if possible, is really ideal for this younger population. Really having things that are objective, temperatures, vital signs, lab values, things that you can really evaluate from an objective standpoint and across all subjects. Avoiding anything that a parent would want to fill out or want to help the subject fill out, really from a time perspective, they can get it done quickly. It really changes how the outcome of the study. So really trying to narrow it down to really what the patient can do. And again, the younger population aren't able necessarily to verbalize things. Really those young, 2 to 8 years old, it really can limit your study. So consider this as you prepare at the beginning. In addition, really thinking up front about, if the subjects are doing very well and they want to continue on, are there any opportunities for an open label extension trial? Providing these opportunities up front, making them aware so that it can be something that they can consider at the time that they complete your study.
So as we've talked about, there are lots of items to consider when planning and participating in pediatric trials. Upfront planning is critical, starting at the protocol level. If you're a sponsor, if you're a CRO, helping the sponsor create that protocol, really thinking about all of those points that we were talking about, minimizing the visits, minimizing the blood volume that you're taking at each visit, or the total amount. Remember, pediatric studies are not just adult studies with the younger subject. This is not a comprehensive list, just a few items to consider when planning your pediatric clinical trial.
So I think at this point, we'll open it up for questions.
Okay, we'll move on to Q&A now. Just a reminder to the audience, there's still plenty of time to submit questions, and you can use your Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We already have some really great questions. So Jamie, and I'm just going to kind of throw these out to you and Ashley. What happens when a well-informed teenage child who is below the age of consent wants to participate in a trial, but the parents refuse to sign the consent?
Thanks. That's a great question. That is definitely, I haven't run across this in my past, but definitely something that you'll need to, the site will need to talk to their IRB, talk to their institution, and figure out the best way to handle that. Always talking to your IRB first is a safe bet.
I also will add to that I think understanding what the parent's reluctance to the participation is, if the child is really interested in participating, having that conversation as a group with the investigator and really getting a good, clear understanding of what their concerns are as well.
Caitlin, how about, can teenage subjects attend visits by themselves?
So that's a great question, something that we talked about previously. Again, something that needs to be worked out in advance, and your IRB needs to, or your institution may have specific requirements. Some certainly would allow it and some wouldn't. So finding out from the IRB what their requirements are.
Yeah, and I think it really is dependent on what type of assessments are being completed at that visit and whether or not that they would be willing to do that.
Can you both go into a little more detail on explaining sibling bias?
Sure. So I think it's really when you have two family members in the same household that are participating in a trial, really, if they both are having very different reactions to the treatment. Again, it may be a blinded study, so they may not know what arm they're on, but they may believe they're on one arm or the other, and so it may affect their documentation of what they have. It may change their reporting of any issues, any adverse events, any needs for additional concomitant medications. And so I think that's really where we're reluctant to see a lot of siblings, because I think that it adds a lot of challenges to, whereas if it's one child in the family, there is nothing to compare it against. I don't know. Do you have any answers to that? Yeah. I think that's really our thoughts on that one.
Are subject home visits ever allowed?
That's a great question. They are allowed. It really just depends on the study. We've worked on a study previously where there were home health nurses and there were, even overnight stays allowed. So again, something that needs to be IRB approved. I know we keep going back to that. Something that needs to be, it's a per institution policy, but we've definitely worked with studies where not only home visits during like a day visit, but also overnight visits with a home health nurse that were part of a study.
Yeah, again, and an extension of that is also things like lab draws at a local lab. Those are definitely happen as well, like if they don't go back to the larger institution, but they need a lab draw done locally. Having those labs listed within your paperwork, within your 1572, making sure it's comprehensive in terms of documentation and that it's listed as part of your site, and really having that information there will help with these types of home visits, and your IRB will have final say, but certainly we've seen it quite a bit.
If siblings can't participate, how do you decide which sibling to enroll?
That's another great question. It needs to be a kind of a multidisciplinary approach. Needs to be discussed with the investigator, depending on, in these rare disease states, oftentimes the primary investigator, the principal investigator, might know the subject from very young, so might have a good understanding of which sibling would be best to participate in the clinical trial, but also needs to be decided, working with the family and deciding which patient, which subject would be better in terms of if there are a lot of lab draws or there are a lot of particular types of assessments that one child doesn't like and doesn't bother the other one. So again, needs to be a whole team decision if only one can participate.
Yeah, and I'll add there as well is really looking at the eligibility criteria. Who would likely meet that eligibility criteria the most? One other factor to consider is who would be the most compliant. I think that if there's several siblings, but one of them has a lot of challenges with swallowing pills, let's say, and it's an oral drug study, perhaps that may help guide the decisions as well.
Do you have suggestions as to how to transition a pediatric subject to an adult subject when a subject turns 18 during the trial or registry period?
Yeah, so as Jamie and I both mentioned, we've been working in cystic fibrosis a lot, and I think that this happens a lot. First, it usually comes from in a clinical setting. At some point, these children, when they become adults, they have to move to the adult doctor or the adult physician. So that's a good transition. Sometimes it's even older than 18, just depending on the particular office. But in terms of clinical trials specifically, just reconsenting and making sure that if anything is different in terms of when they were 17, if certain assessments were required versus when they were 18, keeping those in mind. But usually it's a clinical change first, and they move from the pediatric the pediatric doctor to the adult doctor.
All right, that was our last question. I'd like to thank everyone for attending this Fierce Markets webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd also like to thank our speakers for participating and Ro for presenting today's webinar. Just as a reminder, the webinar has been recorded and you will be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.